All right, we are live. Welcome in the latest episode of that SEC podcast. I'm your host, Michael Bratton. I go by SEC Mike on Twitter. And that right there is Steven Lassan, senior editor over at Athlon Sports. Steven, how's it going, my friend?
Mike, I am doing great. Anytime we are getting together for SEC After Dark, it is always going to be a good time. I will tell you, though, that today being National Signing Day was sort of yearning for the old signing days of the past. Those signing days where like from 6 a.m. to 5 p.m. in February, there were flips and it was crazy all day. I don't know about you, but I kind of miss those days.
Right. I mean, I never got any work done back in those days when I was not in the media, whether I was working in a data center or in school trying to pay attention. Nothing got accomplished on National Signing Day, but now it's kind of the early signing period is the signing period. Hell, I mean, I think there was like 2 or 3 commitments. It was so sad, Steven. I don't know if you caught this, but 24/7 Sports, they had like a graphic of like their live commitments. There was like a 3-star and a 4-star. And that was it. And that was it. And none of them were like SEC related, so I didn't even pay attention to it. But yeah, it's signing day in February is dead.
It was a good day for Texas A&M and LSU fans, picking up a couple of commitments. Funny story is one of the signing days where I was in high school, and it was back when you had to check like the blogs. You had to go to like the message boards. And I remember like basically like running between classes to get from one side of the school to the other to get to class early to be able to use the computer for 3 minutes to see if there were any flips. And so, man, it is funny to think about how things have changed since then. And I don't know that signing period is going to come back, but it is kind of funny to think about how much has changed. And also some of those days where flips were happening, like they were surprises and you had top 100 players uncommitted. So a little different nowadays.
Well, Steven, I think we are dating ourselves talking about heck, it was probably dial-up internet we were using to check these recruits. But
I was. Like an AOL instant messenger too.
The reason we're here today, Steven, one reason for each SEC team to get excited about in 2024, could be a player, could be a coach, it could be just about anything. But there are reasons for excitement for all 16 teams. And a little bonus, I didn't fit this in the title, but Steven's got a potential concern for each team as well. And I haven't seen his list. He hasn't seen mine. And we're going to see if we agree to disagree on the concerns or not. But how's that sound, Steven? Just going in, I like to go in alphabetical order and just hit on all 16 teams, if that's all right with you.
Yeah, that sounds great. Let's get started. I think there's a lot to talk about with 16 teams now in the league for sure.
Mm-hmm. All right, so starting with Alabama, one reason for Alabama fans, not that they need any, well, I guess it is kind of a, there's been reason to not be so excited, but maybe you could turn this fandom 180 here, Steven, after the greatest college coach of all time retired. Why should Alabama fans be excited about 2024?
I forgot in the intro, we mentioned Texas A&M and LSU picking up a big commitment, but Ryan Williams committing to Alabama today was huge. That's huge, I think, for Kalen DeBoer, and especially trying to recruit new territory to win a battle like that. So an early offseason victory. But I think if we're thinking about 2024, I think that what would get me excited if I'm an Alabama fan, it'd be Jalen Milroe and Kalen DeBoer's offense. It looks like Ryan Grubb is still going to be the offensive coordinator there. Some rumors he might go to the NFL. There's no doubt that Jalen Milroe's got to get better as a passer. We saw this last year. We saw it in the Rose Bowl against Michigan. But at the same time, one of the most dynamic quarterbacks in the country with the ball in his hand. And now you pair him with DeBoer and Ryan Grubb, two of the nation's top offensive minds. I would get excited about that if I'm an Alabama fan.
Yeah, and I'm not sure if you've seen this or not, Steven, or anybody listening, watching, but Ryan Grubb, he did meet with, I think it was some boosters down in Alabama today, and he said, hey, I'm going to be your offensive coordinator. My name's Ryan Grubb and all this. So, hey, he's down there. He's working. That doesn't mean he won't leave, because the moment the Seahawks call him and say, hey, we want you to be their offensive coordinator, he is no longer the Alabama offensive coordinator. But It hasn't happened.
It was true today.
Right. It's true today, and hopefully for Alabama's sakes, it is. But I like that. That's a good reason for optimism, Stephen. I similar vein. Kalen DeBoer, in my mind, elite on-field coach. According to CFB Matrix Analytical coaching grades, Kalen DeBoer, the best on-the-field college football coach in the entire country. Now, that's not as a recruiter. They get their own rankings for recruiting and staffing and the coaches they surround themselves with, but they also get a grade for on the field. And Kalen DeBoer, at least according to one non-biased coaching service, is the best coach in the country. I'm pretty dang fired up if I'm an Alabama fan listening to that.
Hard to replace the greatest coach of all time. But at the same time, if you're replacing him with Kalen DeBoer, a guy who's got a track record of winning and being successful at pretty much every job in his coaching career, that would also excite me as an Alabama fan. And, we talked a little bit about some of the positional needs for this team. I think they've upgraded in a big way along the offensive staff. Jamarcus Shepard is one of the better receiver coaches in college football. You add in Scott Huff. I mean, yes, there are questions about how they will adapt to the SEC, but we have data points in the Pac-12 of Kalen DeBoer and how quickly he turned things around at Washington. They're not inheriting a rebuilding project at Alabama. They're walking into one of the best programs in the country right now. So the turnaround should be minimal. They should be able to take what they have and be able to quickly mold it into something successful.
Yeah. So what is a potential concern you have for Alabama?
It's kind of in the same sense of a coaching change. It's the change. It's the amount of change. It's not that you're just replacing the greatest coach in college football history in Nick Saban. It's who you lose off of last year's team. You start talking about losses on the offensive line. Caden Proctor, I know they had some issues at center with snaps, but McLaughlin's gone. And you look on the defense, Dallas Turner, Terrion Arnold, Kool-Aid McKinstry. You also, the receiving core. Your top three weapons from last season, Nye Black and Isaiah Bond and Jermaine Burton are all gone. Caleb Downs transferring to Ohio State. So I think it's just the sheer amount of talent that Alabama loses combined with the coaching change, all that new mixing together. How fast can it all come together for Alabama this year?
Yeah, I hear you, Stephen, and particularly on the defensive side of the ball. Considering every prospect there came in to be coached by Nick Saban, now they're going to get coached by Kane Womack and his defensive crew. How do they fit? That'll certainly be an issue. But this is one of the dumbest comments we've ever got on the history of this show, Stephen. Shout out Citizen X. This is out the world. He's critiquing Kalen DeBoer, saying, last time I saw him on the sideline, they was getting cooked. He's talking about Washington in the national championship. Stephen, you run the Athlon Sports Magazine, and not that the Athlon, we certainly, I respect it, and many others do, but not that it should be the barometer for the end all be all. But where was Washington? Can you give us off the top of your head where did you have them in the preseason last year?
They were 11th, I believe, or they were right there, 10th or 11th in the preseason rankings. Let me throw out a thought on the national championship real quick. I think you have to give Kalen DeBoer a lot of credit in game. Think about how that game started for Michigan, and it looked like Michigan was going to steamroll Washington after the first couple drives. They adjusted, and then they were able to come back. So speaking of the national championship, I think DeBoer and that staff did a nice job of adjusting in that game.
Right, but just how stupid is it to sit here and say, well, he lost in the national championship. He can't coach. And this is not, again, they weren't even preseason top 10. I don't think by any metric. Oregon, I think, was widely considered to be the favorite in the Pac-12. USC got some love. But the fact that this guy beat Texas, beat Oregon twice, and we're sitting here critiquing him in the national how stupid can you be? Come on, we gotta be better than you losing a national championship. You can't coach at all. That's all. Citizen X is Citizen Dumbass is what he is right there for that comment. All right,
he lost in the national championship.
What are we talking about here? Yeah. All right, how about Arkansas, Stephen? One reason for optimism for the Razorback. They need some optimism. What can Arkansas fans be excited about?
the return of Bobby Petrino. An offense that struggled a lot last season was the team's biggest issue exiting 2023. Still have question marks along the offensive line. Obviously need to be able to run the ball better. But we know for all the baggage that Petrino comes with as a head coach, he can coach some offense. And for a situation that Arkansas is in, being desperate to fix this side of the ball, Petrino's a pretty strong hire considering the circumstances. And also, I think his work as the A&M offensive coordinator later in the season when they had to go to Jalen Henderson late, I thought was pretty impressive. Kind of being able to fix that offense on the fly with some of the injuries they had.
Yeah, I'm right there with you, Stephen. I had Bobby Petrino as well, but for a different reason, because I think he is clearly motivated to redeem himself.
Yeah.
And the fact that he was a head coach and he said, hey, I gave that up. I know it was at a lower level, Missouri State, but he gave that up to temporarily be UNLV offensive coordinator, and then obviously got the Texas A&M job. And the fact that he worked, I mean, people, I don't know what in the hell they're thinking, but they think he's over the hill when he improved Texas A&M's overall points per game by over 11 last year in his only season in College Station. But he's staying in the SEC. He's motivated to redeem himself. And probably selfishly, Stephen, he's trying to be a head coach at the highest level. And I think the fact that he has an opportunity to redeem himself to all the people that he burned at Arkansas with all the scandal and everything like that, I just think Bobby Petrino, more than probably any coordinator in the country, has got a lot to prove and a lot of redemption. And for fans thinking that this may be a dead man walking situation with Sam Pittman, I mean, these guys are motivated to turn this thing around, and I think that is something to be very optimistic about.
I think if you go back to the start of the season last year, Arkansas had those blowout losses to Missouri and Auburn later in the year, but before then, despite all the offensive troubles, I mean, they went into Tuscaloosa and pushed Alabama. They gave LSU all they could handle. I mean, I think if I'm an Arkansas fan, probably the reason to be optimistic would be that those losses last year are in the rearview mirror. And hiring Petrino sort of added this little bit of offseason momentum, and they've been a tough out. We saw it last year that before things kind of went downhill, they were feisty and they were tough. The rest tough out for the rest of the SEC. So I think a very hungry, very motivated team, led by a very hungry, motivated coordinator with something to prove, could spell good things for Arkansas this year.
Now, what is a concern? And I hate to say it. I mean, there's probably a lot to pick from here with the Razorbacks.
I think you have to stay on the offensive side. I know it sounds weird to be excited, but also concerned. But also, I think it's fair to wonder, offensive line, how much better can this group get this season? I mean, they brought in 4 transfers. Anytime you bring in offensive line transfers, some different conferences or different leagues, I wonder the level of play they can get to in the SEC, especially at the high level you're going to need in terms of talent. The quarterback position too. Does Arkansas have a difference maker at quarterback on the roster? Is it one of the transfers? Is it a freshman? So I think fair to be excited, but also the unknowns and concerns of the quarterback and offensive line position.
Yeah, I mean, we've reached a point, Stephen, where we can't just give a Sam Pittman coach team the benefit of a doubt on the offensive line, because we've kind of said that to death, and it's not worked. Now they've changed offensive line coach, clearly offensive coordinator. We've talked about that already at length, but you have to figure that some of that newness, the transfers you alluded to, bringing these guys in, maybe we can refresh, restart, and retool, because we all know Sam Pittman, he's done it before. He's developed some elite offensive linemen. Can they get it done? That is obviously probably the biggest concern, because that, again, I think it's more scheme than anything last year that killed them, but the offensive line didn't help, particularly late in the year when they fired Dan Enos. It was still a problem outside of the Florida game.
Maybe some offensive staff cohesion can really help this team and this roster this year. If there was some battling of personalities or schemes with Enos and the other assistants. You probably don't have that this year. Now, Petrino, obviously, we know the personality. He and Jimbo, I'm sure, didn't get along great. But I think, like we said, the redemption, the motivation, and also I think maybe a little bit more consistency, everybody's sort of pushing on the same page could be a big deal.
How about this comment from Jeff? Arkansas can't fire Pittman. Missouri needs an automatic SEC win. Man, that has got to be painful as a Razorback fan to hear, because you expect Missouri, I don't know why, but they expect Missouri to be an automatic win, but it has not quite gone that way. All right, let's move on, Stephen. Auburn, reason for optimism, year 2 under Hugh Freeze on the Plains.
I think you have to hope that coaching continuity, and I don't mean coordinators, I mean just Hugh Freeze's second year translates to better results. I'll also throw out that I think the skill talent that Auburn has, whether it's Jarquez Hunter, I thought he picked up a little bit of steam late last season, and also Cam Coleman at receiver. So I think it's kind of a combination of, you feel that maybe there's a little bit more stability despite the coordinator changes in year 2, and also the potential for the skill talent to be a little bit better this year, maybe.
I gotcha. Yeah. How about this, Stephen? Mine's a little bit different. An influx of young talent from the high school ranks, just signed a top 10 class. Specifically, I'm looking at guys like Cam Coleman, the 5-star, Walker White, 4-star receiver, 5-star edge, Amarius Williams, 4-star edge, Jamonta Waller. I mean, getting these guys. Now, obviously the problem is, can they all contribute? And at least can they contribute at a major level? That's somewhat doubtful, but we need help, particularly at the skill positions all across the board, particularly on offense. We need a more explosive offense at Auburn, and I hope that we get it from some of these new pieces. And I think that is the biggest selling point right now for Auburn. Is I don't know what to make of them, Stephen. I go on shows and they're like, Auburn's a team to watch, right? And I'm like, I just don't know. I mean, could they break out? Certainly. Could they disappoint? I'd buy that too. But I think best case scenario, obviously have a good solid season, but a lot of this young talent emerge, and then you're very, very excited about year 3 with hopefully year 2 of your current coordinators with that continuity. I think that's what you're building towards if you're an Auburn fan.
Yeah, it feels like the foundation isn't quite there to be able to make that leap into the Texas, Tennessee, Georgia, LSU, Ole Miss territory. It feels like they could kind of settle into that second kind of tier just outside the top 25. At least that would be the hope. Also, I think the hope that the second year has to bring a little bit more game to game consistency. Like, it's great to challenge the Alabama, Georgia, but to no show against New Mexico State or Maryland. Those are the kind of the week to week inconsistencies I think you'd like to see worked out if you're an Auburn fan.
So what is your biggest concern for the Auburn Tigers?
Kind of goes into the first one and what you were saying with the skill talent, and that is quarterback play. This is one of the most intriguing quarterback situations to me in the SEC for this season. Peyton Thorne, you look at the numbers last season, he was 12th in SEC games in quarterback rating, 6.4 yards per attempt. So one of the lower rated quarterbacks in the SEC. I think his mobility ended up being a huge asset in some of those games. But really, for Auburn to take a step forward, they need better receiver play. They need everybody on the same page offensively. But the quarterback position really holds the keys to it all. So is it Peyton Thorne? And I think if it's not, the next question for me is, how fast is Walker White being able to get ready to be that kind of quarterback?
Yeah, and I don't know if you saw the comments from Hugh Freeze recently, Stephen, but he's going on about how, his belief in Peyton Thorne and why was everyone pushing him to add a quarterback, this, that, and the other. And it kind of sounded like what we got in the preseason about how excited he was about how Peyton Thorne's like on overdrives, got Hugh Freeze on speed dial, and they're in constant communication, and how this is going to work out so well. And then it hit the field and it was anything but, you know what I mean? So it's, I don't know. I get it. I mean, he's your guy. I get it. But we can't live in an age where we're afraid of competition either, because we didn't have competition. And that's why we put the product on the field we did, and we didn't have any other options. You know what I mean? I mean, they were using Robbie Ashford, but clearly that, aside from his running ability, he is not the passer that could threaten to take Peyton Thorne's job. And just sitting idly by, that could be a huge, huge mistake. I really do think.
I don't think the fans pushed Hugh Freeze to make a late charge potentially at Cam Ward. If the reporting is to be true, Auburn got nervous about the quarterback situation after the Music City Bowl. On Hugh's comments, they really don't Auburn was probably involved with some quarterbacks this offseason. Now, as we go into the spring window, I'm sure there will be a couple guys who pop into the portal. The question is, Peyton Thorne was a late add last year. Can you realistically get a high profile transfer to come in that late, learn the system, and be ready to go? They might have what they have this year at this point.
Mm-hmm. All right, how about the Florida Gators? Steven, is another one. They desperately need reasons for optimism. I got a good one. I'm curious to hear what your optimistic outtake is for the Gators.
I am going to go with a player that I enjoyed watching last year who I don't think got enough credit, and that is Eugene Wilson at receiver. 6 touchdown catches, 61 catches overall. Not a ton of obviously big plays in the high yards per catch average, but we see every year there are freshman receivers who have a pretty good year who break out the next year. So I think he's a guy that he's going to be maybe talked about as a breakout candidate this offseason who could become the go-to guy for Florida. Keep in mind, Florida was a top 30 offense last year by some of the advanced metrics. So there's the pieces there for this offense to be solid once again.
How about this, Steven? This fired me up just thinking about it, getting ready for this exercise. But the quarterback development of Billy Napier. For the life of me, I can't think of the guy's name that he had at Louisiana, but he was pretty decent. Come in here. I know Anthony Richardson was inconsistent, but heck, he got him to be a top 5 draft prospect when Anthony Richardson was on no draft boards leading up to his junior season. Graham Mertz, I think it was universal that he was the 12th, 13th, or 14th best quarterback in the SEC. He was significantly better than that. And, of course, the addition of DJ Lagway, who most, I should say, have as the number 1 quarterback prospect in the class. So just think about if Mertz continues to progress, if Lagway comes in and he lives up to the potential. I mean, we could have a loaded quarterback room with a head coach, play caller that really, really knows how to develop these quarterbacks. And if nothing else, we're likely going to have shortcomings elsewhere, not at receiver like you mentioned, but elsewhere. The great equalizer is always a great quarterback, and Florida may have 2 this fall.
I mean, if you would have told me that Graham Mertz would be a top half quarterback in the SEC this year, I'm not sure I would have believed it last year after what we saw at Wisconsin. But I also think that speaks to the job that Billy Napier and the staff did to get him to that point. I mean, he was rated maybe the worst 12th, 13th best quarterback in the SEC, ended up becoming a guy that could be a fringe preseason all-conference candidate this year. In SEC-only games, Florida was 5th in the conference in scoring. So despite all that transition, despite the quarterback questions, they still had a pretty productive offense last year. And so I think that would – if I was a Florida fan, that would give me some confidence that a Graham Mertz offense that could take a step forward in his second year, or Billy Napier is working with maybe the most talented quarterback that he's had. And there's probably no maybe about it as far as being the head coach at Florida and Louisiana, because Lagway could be that guy, the most talented quarterback he's worked with as a head coach.
Now, here's another one. It may be easy, but biggest concern for the Florida Gators.
Defense. I think optimistically, I know this is a concern section, but we'll be optimistic here. Miles Graham and LJ McCray, plus a lot of returning talent, and Ron Roberts working with that staff. There's hope for improvement. But when you give up almost 34 points a game in SEC contest, and you go down the list of where this defense ranked, whether it was sacks, rush defense, pass defense. There wasn't a lot that they did right last year. Is that going to be enough to turn a corner for Florida this season, given their very difficult schedule?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I obviously defense is a red flag, and we'll play these clips at a later date, Stephen. But did you see Billy Napier today said, we brought in Ron Roberts. He's going to be head coach of defense. He's going to coach the coaches, and the fact that we have a defensive coordinator who needs coaching from another coach. I mean, never in my life, Stephen, do I think I've seen where one side of the ball is not led by either the head coach or a coordinator, it's someone else. That does not exactly speak highly of Austin Armstrong, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think last year's results probably speak to that too. Maybe he wasn't ready to be a high-level SEC defensive coordinator. I regarded as a very highly rising star behind the scenes the last couple of years at the various stops, but might have been too much too soon with a defense that had a lot of turnover and a lot of moving parts. So I think fair to give him a little bit of a pass on last year. And that's why I think getting Ron Roberts in there is probably a good thing. His track record of being a defensive coordinator at some of these stops is pretty solid. So I think it's a good thing for Florida, despite the curious head coach of a defense and titles of all this.
All right. How about Georgia, Stephen? There's so much to be optimistic about. I'm kind of curious, what is the one thing that is on top of your list for the Georgia Bulldogs?
I went with something basic. I think it's the return of Carson Beck. For this reason, Georgia is going to be the preseason favorite because they have maybe the best quarterback in the country coming back in Carson Beck. So maybe the top quarterback in the country passed on the NFL. You're going to be the preseason number one. That alleviates maybe any concern you have about losing Brock Bowers, losing some of your other receivers, Ladd McConkey. So you've got your answer at quarterback, and that's Carson Beck.
Yeah, we're hit on the same thing here, Stephen. I that's exactly what I have for Carson Beck, the year 2 of Carson Beck. But I also threw the caveat, and this may drive some fans nuts, but year 2 of Mike Bobo, who, again, there was no issues with him until we lost a game, and that he's always easy to poke fun at. But year 2 of Carson Beck, year 2 of Mike Bobo, quarterbacks and offensive coordinators coming back. There's that second year bump. There's one other team that I kind of have circled we've not hit on yet that I think has got the potential to have the best offense in the country. But if it's not them, it may very well be the Georgia Bulldogs with all the talent, with year 2 of Carson Beck, year 2 of Mike Bobo running the offense. I think that is also what I'm kind of most optimistic about. So it's kind of interesting that we're on the same page here.
Not to mention if there are some holes to fill along the offensive line, but this offensive line still probably one, two, three, the best in college football. And they went into the portal to fill some of those needs. Trevor Etienne to fill in for the 2 running backs they lost. Also a couple key pickups at receiver. So you've got your star quarterback coming back. Year 2 plus the portal additions will fill in any of those needs around him. I think that's another reason to believe this Georgia offense can maybe take it up a notch next season.
Now, it's easy to pick a reason for optimism for Georgia. I mean, there's so many, but I struggle to even think about what is a concern that you have for Georgia. So what'd you come up for the Bulldogs?
I was going to ask you if you had a really hard time coming up with one, because I did. I eventually settled on the secondary. I think all concerns with Georgia are pretty small. Obviously, they lose Brock Bowers. They have Oscar Delp. They lose Ladd McConkey. We talked about the transfers. Kamari Lassiter, Tyke Smith, Javon Bullard. They're all pretty good players. Maybe All-Americans in some publications this postseason. Missing all 3 of them. You're going to play a lot of good quarterbacks too. That's my concern level is pretty minimal. I have to find something here.
Yeah, this kind of reminds me of a conversation I had a long time ago, Stephen, on this show. I think it was with Clint Lamb, who covers Alabama for On 3 now, but this was leading up to the 2020 season. And I said, what's the biggest concern for Alabama? And it took him a while. And he sat here and said, punter, maybe? I mean, and not that Georgia has a bad punter, but that's basically where we're at with the Georgia Bulldogs. You know what?
Yeah. I mean, you have to almost squint,
Right.
like dig really deep to find a concern for this team. Maybe in a big picture sense, the path to winning the national championship is probably going to get a little harder because you're adding more variables of more games. But they're still, the best team in the country right now.
Well, now I've heard this argument though, Stephen. I'm kind of curious to see where you align. With the expanded playoff, it gives hope to others because there'll be more teams in the dance, but people believe that teams, deepest, more talented teams, it's going to favor them. Heck, it did already, but do you think that'll be a massive advantage in a 12-team playoff era because these teams like Georgia, God forbid, loses a key starter, they've got a very talented backup and so on, and not just at one position, but probably at many critical positions. Do you think it favors teams like Georgia?
I think it favors teams like Georgia. I think it favors teams like Alabama, potentially Texas. I think my concern if I was Georgia is in the past, you had to win 2 games to win the national championship. Now you're adding another game. So the season is longer.
Right.
It's just adding variables to a very chaotic sport. So that would be my concern is you are the best team, but now it's going to be a little harder to get there.
Right. I got you. All right. How about Kentucky, Stephen? A reason for optimism for the Kentucky Wildcats?
How about Dane Key and Barryon Brown? 2 guys who probably don't get enough national attention, dynamic playmakers, obviously on special teams as well. A lot of questions right now because of the quarterback situation. Brock Vandergriff, how good can he be? Who's going to be calling plays for Kentucky? But I think fair to be very excited if you're Kentucky about those 2 receivers coming back.
Now, I went the other side of the ball, Stephen. One of my favorite players in the entire SEC, Deion Walker on the defensive line. I love that guy. All SEC. Heck, if he wasn't All-American, he should have been, in my opinion. He's one of the best out there. And, when you have that unique game wrecker on the interior of your defensive line, it can just completely change the dynamic of your defense and make it's just so hard to block. It's as crazy as it is to say, you can kind of scheme around an edge rusher, even a dominant one potentially, but it's very, very difficult to scheme around someone that is wrecking the middle of your defense on a consistent basis. So, I like your selections. I love those Barryon Brown and Key, but Deion Walker for me, he's just such a freak.
I hate to keep using that word underrated, but it does feel like Walker is really underrated. 12 and a half tackles for a loss last season, probably flew under the radar nationally. I don't think he'll do that this year. I think he'll probably be a preseason All-American. And also adding Jamon Dumas-Johnson as sort of the second level cleanup guy, you add him to work behind Walker. That's a pretty good place to start if you're Kentucky's defensive front.
Right. And so what is your concern? I'm curious to know if we have the same one because I have a feeling we might for the Kentucky Wildcats.
I wrestled with 2 here. There's the whole A&M thing that's still kind of weird for Kentucky, but also there's just the unknowns right now offensively. You've got a new play caller taking over for Liam Cohen. Who is it going to be? You also have the quarterback situation. If you look at the last, this Brock Vandergriff will be like the 3rd transfer to start. Will Levis and Devin Leary. He's the least proven of them all at this point of his career. So it'll be an interesting year for Kentucky's offense.
Interesting. So we got something actually different here, Stephen. I went with the return of Eric Wolford, who I question how good of an offensive line coach he is. Will the Big Blue Wall make a return? Because they have been missing in action for several seasons here, Stephen. And I think that is a strong indicator of where we are as a program because it seems like we are in decline. It's not totally. I mean, heck, they were playing in a bowl game against Clemson about 2 months ago. So it's not like they're awful or anything, but That's the DNA of Mark Stoops' program, or at least it was, and that has been missing. We've kind of been playing around the offensive line, and had we had a strong offensive line the last couple of seasons, Kentucky may have been a dark horse SEC title contender, but they flat out they've been bad, more often bad than good.
Add in the loss of Ray Davis as well. I think Chip Trainium is going to be a solid player, but I think Ray Davis is, I think he's just a better overall running back. So you're losing something there, and also I think fair to wonder sometimes too, like Davis probably made up for some of the question marks on the offensive line, considering how good he was. So I think the optimist in me would say they've got a lot of guys back. I'm a little skeptical of the Wolford hire too. I don't think, Zach Yinzer, their former offensive line coach, did a great job. Wolford was working with more talent at Alabama. They weren't that good.
Right.
I wonder. It's curious.
All right. How about LSU, Stephen? What are you most optimistic with the LSU Tigers?
About Blake Baker taking over as defensive coordinator. LSU paid big time money to go out and upgrade this defensive staff, and man, was it needed, because there is no reason that LSU's defense should give up 33 points a game in SEC contests. Just too much talent at LSU. Yes, they had some personnel concerns in the secondary, but very strange for me to see LSU at the bottom of the SEC in defense. So I think given his track record at Missouri, LSU just hired one of the best defensive coordinators in college football.
Yeah. And how about shout out David, Stephen, comment of the day so far on the show. Nick Saban is taking Butch Jones to ESPN alongside him as a coffee analyst. So I appreciate that with David. But no, I agree with you, Stephen. And in a similar vein, Brian Kelly not being content with 20 wins in 2 seasons and 1 division title, and essentially blowing up his entire coaching staff because they weren't getting it done, because winning 20 games in 2 seasons is to be celebrated at a lot of places, but that's not the bar for LSU. And that's not what he said when he took his job. He said, I'm coming down here to win a national championship. And they've fallen short. Again, I'm not saying he should be on any kind of hot seat or anything, but he's fallen short of that lofty expectations. So I think this is a great sign for LSU fans that he's sitting here and taking a hard look in the mirror and saying we've been good, sometimes very good, but not elite, and we're blowing this thing up to get there.
I think it's a great sign. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But there are some concerns. What do you think is the biggest concern here?
I'm actually going to stay on defense. Obviously, losing Jaden Daniels, losing the 2 receivers is significant, so there will be some offensive regression. But Brian Kelly said it today at his press conference with the defensive line. They may have to flip some offensive linemen to the defensive side. Still going to go after some guys in the portal to maybe fill some of those voids up front. The defensive line could be a real spot of concern for this team. So I will be very curious to see if they can land a couple transfers maybe after the spring that solidify this group, because I think with the returning personnel and the transfers they've added in the secondary, they're probably going to be a little bit better back there. But still, I think that line is still going to be a concern.
Mm. All right. How about Ole Miss, Stephen? What is your most optimistic? There's a lot to like about Ole Miss right now, but what is one thing that stands out to you?
I'm going to be a little kind of big picture with this one. I think it's a roster that is built to win right now. You have a starting quarterback in Jackson Dart that is one of the best in the SEC. He's one of the best in college football. You've got Trey Harris coming back at receiver. You've brought in a transfer class that's 1-2 the best in college football, with defensive difference makers in the second year of Pete Golding. So roster built to win right now would be my reason to get excited if I'm Ole Miss.
So this was the team I was talking about, Stephen, earlier that I kind of teased. I think Ole Miss has the potential to be the best offense in the entire country. With Jackson Dart back, being a starting quarterback 3 years in the SEC, that's basically unheard of. You got Trey Harris back, bringing in Juice Wells, bringing in some offensive linemen, bringing back some offensive linemen, bringing back, I know Judkins is gone, but they're bringing back other runners with Kiffin running it, and Charlie Weiss help, where he's growing a big time reputation in coaching circles as being a real asset to this Ole Miss offense. I think Ole Miss, if not the best offense in the country, I mean, you're splitting hairs here, but I mean the highest scoring and with the pace they go with and everything, I think Ole Miss is in a position to basically outscore pretty much everyone they play, and that may have to be the method that if they were to win an SEC championship, if they were to make the college football playoff, that's going to be their ticket. It's not going to be a defensive slugfest. It's going to be high scoring affairs, but there's probably not a better offensive unit in the country than the one in Oxford right now.
I think you could also make the argument that if their offense is as good as we think it is, and it's probably going to be based upon the returning personnel. I like some of the offensive linemen too. They brought in from the portal to solidify a group that was probably inconsistent last year. Mm-hmm. You don't need a defense that's first in the SEC and fewest points allowed. It goes back to being timely and just finding ways to get off the field on third downs in the red zone and forcing a couple turnovers with that offensive firepower that you have.
But that being said, hey, we just pumped them up, Steven. What's a concern you have for Ole Miss?
I think it's replacing Quinshad Judkins. Now, I understand the argument and certainly subscribe to the theory that running backs are easy to replace of all the positions. Replacing a left tackle is a lot harder. Quinshad Judkins is pretty special, though. And Logan Diggs and Ulysses Bentley are going to be a solid tandem. Are they going to be as effective as Quinshad Judkins? That would be my reason for concern.
Yeah, and particularly, I guess, a high-level competition they're going to face in the SEC down the road, potentially in the playoff. Those kind of difference makers are tough to replicate, to your point. So, yeah, I'm right there with you. But I think I'm a little bit more concerned about the defense and how they would stack up. Now, they got some good players over there, and they've added some via the portal, obviously. But I think because, again, I still think they're going to outscore everybody. So there's going to be a game or two where the defense probably going to bite them, kind of like we have. I'm thinking of Tennessee, South Carolina now. Hopefully it's never that bad. You know what I mean? But those games will catch up on you. Even if you do have the best offense in the country, defense in this league, it'll get you.
Yeah, you just got to find a way to get timely stops. Like we said, if you're Ole Miss, I think the optimism would be that, Pete Golding in his second year automatically you would expect some improvement from year one to year two, but now you're adding some guys like a Walter Nolan that can be a difference maker. But, if this defense doesn't work out and it's playing at the level it was last year, getting to the playoff could be a challenge, or it could be a very short stay in the playoff when you're playing Oregon or Ohio State or, another team from the SEC.
Mm-hmm. All right. How about Mississippi State, Steven? First year under Jeff Lebby. What are you most optimistic about here?
Let's go with the transfer class that Mississippi State is bringing in, because they are losing a lot off of last year's team that frankly wasn't very good. I think a lot of that was due to coaching, but they're losing a lot, and they went into the portal to get help right away. A couple guys that I think are worth spotlighting. I think number one is Blake Shapen. How good is he right away? If not, is Michael Van Buren ready to play at quarterback? And also, I like Kelly Akari, the receiver from UTEP, because he can stretch the field. And in these Baylor-style offenses, you need a guy that can split out wide, take the top off the defense to open up some other things. They also brought in 4 offensive linemen, and that's key because of some of the needs that they have.
Mm-hmm. And Steven, I went a little bit different direction, but just how unwatchable, maybe not the right word, but how unentertaining Mississippi State was on offense last year. And even, may he rest in peace, never say anything bad about Mike Leach, but his offense was not the driving force for their success his last season there. They were at times kind of, heck, they won 9 games, so it's kind of hard to pick it apart. But it was more defense than anything. So I think why I'm optimistic if I'm a Mississippi State fan, Steven, I think the offense, when it's clicking, is going to be so fun to watch. And this is similar to Tennessee and Ole Miss. I mean, this is the same similar system. Obviously what Oklahoma had last year. When it's clicking, this is just a over the moon. You get excited watching this thing.
It's almost like if you know you're going to be rebuilding and it may take some time, at least Mississippi State won't be boring, and they will be interesting because of the style on offense to where they could at least keep things competitive. And I think that's kind of the equalizer for this team. Like, they have to do something different given their personnel challenges. It is a hard job to begin with. This is kind of the perfect style offense to do that with.
Mm-hmm. So what is a concern? There's a lot through here, but what is a concern for Mississippi State?
I was going to say pretty much everything, because it's really all of the transition
Right.
on the coaching staff. You also have, we mentioned Shapen, Van Buren. Can they find a consistent quarterback to execute that high-powered offense? So you look back at last year, to your point, they had one win in SEC play, and it was that 7-3 barn burner against Arkansas. They really weren't competitive in the SEC outside of that. So there's a lot of transition and a lot of new here that has me concerned.
That was one of those where you just burn the tape, even if you won the game, and you just never again will we watch this thing. You know what?
Yeah, no, yeah, that was the Jefferson Pilot Sports Game of the Year for the SEC.
Yeah.
That's for last year.
All right, Mizzou fans, Stephen, they're on cloud nine. It seems like they've never had it better, and I don't think they have in the SEC at least. What's something that stands out to you, the most reason to be optimistic for these Mizzou fans?
I think outside of just general momentum in the program, how about the combination of Brady Cook and Luther Burden in the second year of Kirby Moore's offense? The jump that Brady Cook made, we talked earlier about Graham Mertz and the development that he made. Brady Cook, I didn't think he was going to have this kind of season. He goes out there and ends up being one of the better quarterbacks in the SEC. Now he's back with one of the SEC's better receiving cores with an All-American and Luther Burden. I think that's a reason to be excited about, considering some of the question marks on defense.
Yeah, hey, I'm going to go there as well, but I would also add the schedule. Only team in the SEC where their combined opponent records last year was a losing record, so everything's lining up for Mizzou to have a great season. But I'm going to go similar to you. I just have Luther Burden circled in red ink here because I think he could be the best receiver. I think he is the best receiver in the country. He may be the most dominant overall player in the country. And this is something that, I think Mizzou's going to be a popular team next year, Stephen. Obviously not just among their fans, but I think around the country, people that have no idea, never watched Mizzou, they're gonna tune in. They'll see the highlights. They'll see the clips on social media because I think Luther Burden's going to make some people look foolish, and they're going to gain a lot of fans. They're going to be a popular team. They're going to be an exciting team, and I think Luther Burden's got a real opportunity. If Mizzou does what I think they can win 10 and 11 games, I think he's going to be a Heisman Trophy candidate. I really do.
Yeah, I was going to say as we go into the 2024 season, I would assume that Carson Beck and Jalen Milroe and probably Dylan Gabriel of Oregon, along with Quinn Ewers, are probably your early Heisman frontrunners. But if you're looking for like a dark horse or someone that's not going to be probably picked in that list, Luther Burden would be it. I mean, over 1,000 yards last year, sort of all-purpose threat, just dynamic with the ball in his hands. I mean, I think every Saturday when I watch games, it's almost like Missouri was fun to watch last year because they were so good, but it was also Luther Burden almost needs like his own ISO cam where we can just see every play that he is involved in because he's so exciting with the ball, with his hands on anything, whether it's receptions or rushing attempts or whatever.
Right, but now we got to be a little negative here, Stephen. What is one thing that may be a concern?
Gonna cheat here and give you two. I think Missouri is losing what I would call some heart and soul guys in the program. Like Hopper, Robinson, Cody Schrader, all leaving, all seniors, instrumental to last year's success. I think in the big picture, the defense would concern me if I'm Missouri. There's still a nice foundation, but they're losing key pieces at every level. There's a new coordinator. How does it all fit together? How much? I would expect some regression, but how much? The schedule and the offense kind of alleviate any concerns that you might have there, though.
Right. Yeah, this may be a situation where we're late in the season and we may not, I'm not saying they won't be tested, but it's almost like Georgia last year where the concern was we could get into November. We don't even know what we have in our quarterback. And that, again, Carson Beck was pretty awesome last year, but then when they got that SEC championship, I don't want to say he lost them the game, but he got outplayed. So, yeah, I think that's a fair critique there.
I think I was a little surprised that Corey Batoon was the pick as defensive coordinator from Missouri. Doesn't necessarily mean it's not going to work out. I think I just expected that there'd be a bigger name, but also a little bit of trust in Eli Drinkowitz to hire the right coordinator. He promoted Blake Baker. They also hired, Kirby Moore last year. So his recent coordinator hires have been good. So maybe it ends up working out, but schedule's favorable, explosive offense that sort of maybe takes down your concern a little bit if you're Missouri.
Hey, Steven, didn't I just say I thought Luther Burden could be a Heisman candidate here? Jeff says, no respect for Missouri. That ain't respectful. Have they ever had a Heisman Trophy winner?
Man, I mean, Chase Daniel was in the mix. Brad Smith. We could, I mean.
Oh, my God.
Hey, not to mention, I have Missouri in my top 10 for my early preseason ranking. So
that ain't good enough, Steven. Top 5 or bust.
Right.
Okay. All right. How about Oklahoma? So what's your most optimistic about here?
I'm going to cheat. So I apologize, Mike, but I'm going to say, first of all, the reason to be excited is Oklahoma is moving to the SEC. They're in the best conference in college football. I think of all the excitement of Texas making the playoff last season, I think also forgot that Oklahoma got better too. They got a lot better in the second year under Brent Venables. Which leads me to, I am very excited to watch Jackson Arnold next season. I know he was up and down in the Alamo Bowl. Some of that was, personnel losses, first start, whatever. So I am very excited to see the kind of development that Jackson Arnold can make, because if he makes a big jump as they go into the SEC, some of the other concerns you have about Oklahoma can be alleviated.
Yeah, on a similar vein, I went with this, Steven. Jackson Arnold to Nick Anderson connection. Nick Anderson, anybody that missed it, SEC fans may not be familiar, freshman receiver for Oklahoma. He broke the all-time Oklahoma school record for single season touchdown receptions as a true freshman. So Jackson Arnold, if he lives up to the hype, to Nick Anderson, that could be one of the best connections in all of college football next season. I'm very, very excited to see Jackson Arnold to Nick Anderson. How many touchdowns can they have in their first season as an SEC team?
Yeah, like Nick Anderson is like the old, Chris Carter with Chris Berman. All he does is catch touchdowns. Like 10 of his 38 catches went for touchdowns. Keep an eye on Purdue transfer Deion Burks if you're an Oklahoma fan. I think he could be an impact guy right away, only adding to Jackson Arnold's weapons.
Mm-hmm. But what is a concern? And I think this one is kind of obvious for the Oklahoma Sooners.
Offensive line.
Yeah.
Basically, your entire offensive line is basically gone. They brought in some transfers. They've had some guys they brought in last year. They're going to be counting on to play right away. The positive is Bill Bedenbaugh, the offensive line coach, is one of the best in the nation. So they have a lot of questions, but they got the right assistant trying to find the right 5.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's exactly where I was going, replacing everybody on the offensive line. Not ideal in life in the SEC, but we'll see how they stack up. All right, how about South Carolina, Steven? What's something to be optimistic about there?
Newcomers. I think a lot of intrigue with this transfer class that South Carolina has with Rocket Sanders filling a big-time need at running back. If he's back to the 2022 Rocket Sanders that we saw, I think that's huge for South Carolina's running game. But also it's Lenore Sellers stepping up at quarterback, and they brought in Dylan Stewart and Josiah Thompson too, the two big time recruits in this class. So there's a lot of, I think, the core of young talent plus transfers at South Carolina is pretty promising.
Mm-hmm. Now, how about this, Stephen? Hopefully this makes sense. But I'm saying for South Carolina, every season has kind of gone against the grain, so to speak. I remember when Shane Beamer took it over, it was like, man, they may not make a bowl game for 3 or 4 years. They made it immediately. And then, of course, year 2, the huge upset of Tennessee, backed that up by beating Clemson. I mean, that was just two, and they beat Florida. That was a big upset at the time. I mean, these were things that, I guess that was year 1. But Tennessee and Clemson, those were huge upsets, and they went to not only go to a bowl, but a better bowl than anticipated. And then last year, though, fell short of expectations. So now we're going into a year where expectations will be low. And if that trend line continues and they continue to kind of go against the grain, maybe South Carolina sneaks up on all of us once again, because whatever they did those first 2 years, maybe they get back to that and they can kind of overachieve, if that makes sense.
It does. And I think it's also fair to say they're probably due for some good luck because of all the injuries they had last season, difficult schedule. The schedule's still tough this year. So I think, to your point, like the bounces could go their way, and they overachieved in year 1 where the expectations were low. And that's kind of the theme, I think, for South Carolina this year. I think they'll be picked pretty low. But if those newcomers, quarterback hits, I think they got a chance to maybe surprise and get back to at least a bowl game this year.
Stephen, how great is it? I know you're not paying attention to the comments like I am, but we got like a war going on here between Texas and Oklahoma fans on an SEC show. I love it. I love it.
They're fitting right in already.
So what is your biggest concern here for a South Carolina program?
I think it still remains the line of scrimmage. Offensive line, defensive line. Can they stop the run, and can they also protect the quarterback? They only had 16 sacks last year in SEC games. I know they sort of shifted their defense late in the season to do more 3-3-5, but they got to get to the quarterback more, and they've got to be able to protect and run the ball better this season.
Yeah, I mean, simply put, this is true anywhere, but it's especially true in the SEC. If you can't stop the run, you got no chance. And they were just pathetic stopping the run. That has got to be shored up. Otherwise, heads on that coaching staff are going to roll. And quite honestly, I'm surprised they didn't make more changes on the defensive staff after last season's results.
I was very surprised that, like to our discussion last week about coordinators on the hot seat, at the middle point of the season where there was one of those halftime interviews where Shane Beamer seemed so frustrated with his defense. Surprised to see Clayton White back. So I think fair to say he's squarely on the hot seat as they begin this year.
Right. All right. How about Tennessee, Stephen? What's something that stands out that is most reason to be excited for them Vols?
Nico. I think he's one of the most anticipated, maybe one of the most highly touted breakout quarterbacks this year. If he is as good as most people think he can be, the offense is back to Hendon Hooker levels, which gets Tennessee into the mix to be a playoff team this year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I kind of figured you'd go with Nico, Steven, so I was leaning somewhere else. I think the offensive line has a chance to really be special. Bringing in Lance Hurd from LSU to put him at left tackle, John Campbell putting him more at his more natural right tackle, bringing back Cooper Mays, Spraggins is back for another year. I mean, I think that is a potential. They still got to figure out left guard, but there's options there that if they can solidify that one spot, I think this is going to be the strength of Tennessee's football team, which is only going to suit a young quarterback, first year as a starting quarterback with plenty of weapons. They got good tailbacks, good receivers. If they can block, if they can run block like they did last year, Tennessee's going to be back to very, very, very dangerous on offense.
It feels weird to say their running backs are going to be a strength considering who they're losing. But yeah, I think based upon everything we've seen, and Tennessee's going to be just fine there. Brew McCoy coming back to 100%. But also, you mentioned the offensive line. You're solidified at maybe the three most important positions: left tackle, right tackle, and center, to protect your quarterback. So I think I would feel pretty good about the offense getting better for Tennessee this year.
Yeah, and to your point, this is why I say it could be special, because those three spots are locked down. But I think probably the best offensive lineman they got is Spraggins, the right guard. So if we're solidified at three spots, we got a great guard. Again, we just got to nail down that final one. And I think Tennessee could have one hell of an offensive line, but there are some concerns, and I got a good feeling where you go with the Vols. What's the biggest concern here?
Defense. If you looked at the defensive numbers from Tennessee just on the kind of surface, I think you drill down into SEC games and there was a little bit more of a concern. The numbers on the surface look good, but 5.7 yards per play in 2022 in the SEC, 5.8 last year. So there's been some progression, but now you're entering the fourth year under coordinator Tim Banks. I think this defense needs to take a step forward. You also lost Tyler Barron, the secondary, a lot of new pieces coming in too. So I'll be curious to see how this group performs early on.
Yeah, it's got to be defense, and specifically for me, Steven, defensive backs. It's kind of been a train wreck there on and off for a couple of seasons. All kinds of new faces here. Shout out Slim, mentioning James Pierce. Hopefully that elite pass rush, that kind of helps those defensive backs as they come along, particularly in their first SEC game on the road at Norman. It's not going to be an easy task, but if Tennessee can get after Jackson Arnold and kind of have their way with that new look Sooner offensive line, that could be the matchup that determines that game.
Man, early in the season, Jackson Arnold versus Nico, speaking of high-scoring affairs, could be really, really entertaining just between the two quarterbacks and the question marks maybe on both defenses. So I think to James Pierce and you look at a guy going to be probably. I've seen some chatter about him potentially being the first pick in next year's NFL draft. He's certainly going to be a preseason All-American. So if you can get some pressure, it sort of alleviates some of the concerns on the back end. But no doubt about it, I think Tennessee's offense is good enough to make the playoff. The question, if they can catch Georgia and some of these other teams, will be how far along this defense gets this year. Improvement.
Mm-hmm. All right, how about Texas? There's so many Texas fans already in here, Stephen. They're fired up. They got a reason to be optimistic. They're eyeing the playoff, not only the playoff, but the national championship. What has got you most excited about the Longhorns?
How about trajectory? The fact that this program went from 5-7 in Steve Sarkisian's first year to making the playoff 3 years later. They're going to be picked as a preseason top 5 team. You've got Quinn Ewers coming back. I like what they did at receiver too. I know that losing Xavier Worthy and A.D. Mitchell, Jatavian Sanders is huge, but I like Silas Bolden, the pickup from Oregon State, Matthew Golden too, Isaiah Bond. I mean, they solidified their biggest question mark. They've got one of the best quarterbacks in the country returning. I think Steve Sarkisian's got this program trending in the right direction as they come into the SEC.
Mm-hmm. And I went overall talent and depth on both lines of scrimmage, which I think will serve Texas incredibly well. And if they do win the SEC, make the college football playoff and go far, it's going to be because of that depth, because of that talent they got on the line of scrimmage. I think that's going to be the difference there.
Left tackle Kelvin Banks should be a preseason All-American, to your point. That's a group that's kind of grown up over the last couple years for Texas. I do have some concerns about their defensive line, but can I go ahead and get into I'm a little I don't say concerned, but I think it is going to be a work in progress because their pass rush needs to be better. They're also losing Murphy and Sweat on the defensive front. So there's some turnover there. I think the optimism is they have recruited so well that there's so much talent. There's going to be depth eventually that they should be fine. But I think the turnover on defense would be my biggest concern for this team.
All right, staying in the state of Texas, Stephen, Texas A&M, a lot of buzz down in College Station. What's the thing you're most optimistic about the Aggies?
Mike Elko. I think they've upgraded massively as a head coach who is way more organized, better at player development. I think program building. If you're Texas A&M, you're in a much better spot than you were at this time last year under Jimbo Fisher. So I trust Mike Elko to take all that talent, all that potential, and turn it into results on the field.
That's interesting. You went defense. Well, you went head coach, but that I consider that kind of defense. Because I went, we're going away from Jimbo Fisher offense and having his hands in it. I know it was Bobby Petrino, and I know they got better, but still, his fingerprints were on it. Get him the hell away from the football, and I think could not be any more reason for excitement if I'm a Texas A&M fan.
No question. I think Colin Klein is I think will do a better job of adapting. I think he'll be better liked in the program for Texas A&M.
Yep.
And you've got a promising quarterback in Connor Wigman to build around. So things are definitely looking up in the offensive rooms at Texas A&M.
So, but what is your biggest concern now with the Aggies?
How about pass defense? Last year in 6 games that they played against teams with a winning record, they gave up over 300 passing yards a game. Some of that can be skewed because, shootouts, high scoring games. But still, I think we knew that pass defense and depth in the secondary was an issue, and it was only solidified when they brought in 8 defensive backs from the transfer portal this offseason.
Yeah, that's exactly where I was going to go too. Although I've got faith that Mike Elko and company can fix that side of the ball. So I'm very optimistic that we could turn that around. But until we actually see it, that is obviously a huge concern. So last but not least here, Vanderbilt, Steven, what is your reason for optimism? This was a struggle for me.
I am excited, if I'm a Vanderbilt fan, about Diego Pavia, the quarterback transferring in from New Mexico State. Because earlier this offseason, after A.J. Swan transferred, Ken Seals, Walter Taylor, they were looking around the quarterback room to see who had any eligibility. Damian Allen, maybe they were trying to see if he had any eligibility from the 90s still left over. But now they have a starter who can at least raise the floor at Vanderbilt. How does his play from Conference USA translate into the SEC is a fair question. He was great at Auburn when New Mexico State played last year, and they had the same offensive coordinator. Tim Beck came over from New Mexico State to Vanderbilt. So I think at least they have a quarterback that makes them competitive on offense.
Yeah, and so again, this may be a bit of a stretch, Steven, but this is, whoa, there he is. He's here. It's Jerry Kill. Jerry Kill's at my house, Steven. That's why I'm excited. All right, he's not going to stop. But the fact that he turned around New Mexico State, Steven, and they have brought him in at Vanderbilt to help Clark Lee in that transition to build this program up. If I'm a Vanderbilt fan, if nothing else, I'm saying we got the expertise of Jerry Kill in here.
No question. Jerry Kill has won everywhere he's been as a head coach. And New Mexico State is one of the hardest places to win in college football. And the fact that he was able to get them competitive right away. I know he's not an on-field assistant, but at a place like Vanderbilt, someone who has a track record of maximizing what you have, I think is a huge asset. So any kind of brain power you can add to a staff like that, if you're Clark Lee's a huge win.
Right. And then I don't even know if I have to ask, Steven, but what's your biggest concern with Vanderbilt?
Defense. I have been very surprised since Clark Lee arrived that their defense has been that bad. I mean, they have been last in the SEC in points allowed for 3 consecutive years, almost 40 points a game allowed in the SEC. For a guy who was a good defensive coordinator at Notre Dame, that's pretty shocking to me.
Right. And at times, Steven, the offense has been exciting. There's been explosive plays. There's been solid receiver play, running back play, at times quarterback play even under Clark Lee. So, I mean, I hate to bury him because I know it's such a tough job, and clearly they had no NIL till recently and all this, but and so many laundry list of issues there that makes it difficult to be competitive. But do you think we are trending towards where we may get to a point where we say Clark Lee, great defensive coordinator, but not head coach material?
I think so. Last week when we did the hot seat, I had him as like a 4, inching closer
Right.
to hot seat territory. I think there has to be some tangible progress this year. I think, to your point, there have been flashes of it. It hasn't shown up enough consistently. And I think by year 4, you would expect some of that to start paying off. Now, it's a little different because of the NIL and the transfer situation. So you could almost build a team and let them take their hits in year 1, and by 2 and 3 you see progress. So I think it is a critical year because we get into that conversation of proof of concept, momentum. If you're not winning games, it gets harder to sell on the recruiting trail. And I think for Vanderbilt trying to do all the stuff it wants to do with facilities, donations start to dry up as well if you're not winning.
Yeah. Well, Steven, we hit on all 16 teams. Went over an hour, well over an hour here. Got any closing thoughts before we wrap this one up?
I'll close with what we started with. I miss the old days of signing day, the chaos and all that. But can you believe that spring practice is almost right around the corner? I guess that's the positive thing, right?
Right. Yeah. And I've said it before, Steven, I'll say it again. I think spring practice gets more and more important every year with coaching turnover and now player turnover to the level that it is. And with the portal reopening after spring, there's really an emphasis on finding out where you're strong, where you're weak, where you need help, where you don't, so that you can kind of figure out those last couple spots in free agency. So, yeah, I mean, spring football is vitally important to the sport, but I think now more than ever, it is even more important, if that makes sense.
It makes a lot of sense. And I saw an interesting quote from a head coach on signing day. It was Tony Elliott at Virginia, and how worried he was about turnover in the spring because you're not going to see the amount of players entering the portal to replace them. So it'll be interesting to see because obviously the SEC has its rule. You can't transfer within the SEC. The movement outside the SEC, the next couple months, not saying tampering, I was going to say networking, teams that didn't fill their needs have a very short window to do so in the next transfer session. So I think there'll be some urgency to start identifying guys and try to get them in quick.
Yeah, without a doubt. Well, Steven, I appreciate you, as always, jumping on here and going so in depth with me. Fun times, as always. Appreciate each and every one of you for hanging out, especially those on the live show. But, before we go, Steven, of course, tell everybody, how can they follow you? How can they find your work?
You can follow me on Twitter at AthlonSteven, and you can follow me on YouTube, all CFB 365, Facebook and Instagram, Stephen L. CFB. I'll leave you with one little nugget. I've worked quite a bit the last couple of days on some covers for the college football magazine for Athlon Sports. So it's coming up fast.
Yeah, well, can't wait for that, Steven. And hey, we appreciate your shoelace $10 donation. Love the show. Appreciate you guys. We appreciate you, shoelace, and Kyle and all the gang getting rowdy in the comments all for an hour plus. But we appreciate you, and we'll catch you all